It's me, Pup. How are you doing? I, for one, am feeling pretty okay, because today we are talking about Marvel's Wolverine, the upcoming video game from Insomniac Games. Now, I've already made a video giving my thoughts on the 7-minute gameplay review. On a whole, it looks a lot like a mod of Marvel's Spider-Man. However, I do like the much more linear gameplay style, but I also think the realism art style isn't really serving it. We can do better in terms of visuals as far as I'm concerned. But I said I wanted to do a separate video on Wolverine's costume. And I know that on Twitter, people have been quite critical of this. But Twitter's just a bubble. People on there just love to... No, there are actually some good points being made. Points that I agree with. So here's how Wolverine looks in Insomniac's upcoming Marvel's Wolverine game. Now, I have been quite mixed on the overall designs of these Insomniac Marvel characters from what we've seen in the Marvel Spider-Man games. And I think a problem with Insomniac's Marvel costumes is the same overall problem that Square Enix had with their Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy designs. They are redundant because they are just another extrapolation on MCU design philosophy. These things are meant to look realistic and practical, but they're also supposed to be tactical too, and then you kind of weave the comic book design around that. And the same very much goes for Wolverine here. Wolverine's Insomniac suit can easily be compared to MCU Captain America's suit. A protective armor with reinforced fabrics, kind of like a police vest. And we can see here how elements of Wolverine's comic design have been repurposed into this art style. The tiger stripes on Wolverine's side are now straps with little buckles on the end, so it squares off the triangular shape language here. And if we look at the back, all of that tiger stripe imagery has been squared off at the ends there too. Like an MCU costume, there's lots of piping and panel lining on there. If anything, the costume is more muted than MCU Wolverine's costume. But there's one detail here that I really want to talk about, and that is Wolverine's cowl, which looks really off. For one, it's incredibly boxy. It's got a very heavy sort of metallic industrial look to it. But then speaking of panel lining, like what is that there? But the big issue for me is just how thick these fucking fins on his face are. They're supposed to kind of come out at the eye line and be a bit more, like, angled than this and a bit rounder than this. But on Insomniac's version, his head looks like a fucking boomerang. Overall, Insomniac Wolverine's costume is okay. It looks like Wolverine. My issue is it just feels like a rejected design for MCU Wolverine, meaning that in the grand scheme of things, it's just not that interesting looking. I mean, hell, even with Spider-Man, while I might not like the giant white spider on the chest, like, that was at least a new signature for Insomniac Spider-Man, to differentiate him from the MCU version just a little bit. In the case of Wolverine here, it's, again, just an extrapolation on the same concept as the MCU version. I do notice that the blue parts of the costume are largely absent here, replaced with blue-black, particularly on the gloves, and then everything has like a rubbery shine to it. I will say, I do think this costume succeeds at what it sets out to do. A realistic-ish, grounded-ish version of Wolverine that feels like something out of the MCU. It does that successfully. The only element here that I really dislike is the mask, and that is purely down to execution. But I also don't think this is anything remarkable. At the same time, though, I can see why you might prefer this over the MCU's version. I generally think these two are just the same largely, but there are areas where Insomniac's Wolverine does a better job at retaining the shape language from classic Wolverine. Looking at MCU Wolverine, and I will say it pops a lot more, and that is largely thanks to the colors and lighting. That's not me saying that the lighting in Deadpool and Wolverine is better than the one in Wolverine the game, but when you've got flatter lighting, it definitely complements the yellow and blue a bit better. And I will say I much prefer the colors of MCU Wolverine. I prefer these shades. I prefer that the fabric isn't shiny. I prefer that the blue is confidently blue, not just blue-black. But it is funny because, like the Insomniac Wolverine suit, this costume gets way more criticism on Twitter than anywhere else I've observed. But it's also kind of fair and valid. The main criticism tends to be that if you just change this thing's colors, take away the yellow and blue, it could be an Ant-Man suit or a Daredevil suit. But I will say I do think this argument really underestimates how important color is to design. Because, I mean, you could take the same argument and say, okay, take the cowl off of Batman and change the colors and you could just make it into a Superman suit, and that is true. The way these suits would differentiate from each other in the comics was by being different colors. And only then can you truly appreciate how revolutionary Spider-Man's design was. But a lot of the issues with shape language that I mentioned with the Insomniac design are also true of the MCU one. Again, Wolverine's design in the comics is very triangular. He has stripes, tiger stripes. These are pointy, these are triangular. But the MCU generally has square shape language. And you can see here where they have squared off all of those pointy angles, particularly on the tiger stripes on the side of his waist. And the effect this has is design readability. You can barely tell he's got the black stripes there on this costume. So they've added little yellow accents to them to make them more visible, but in the end you just end up seeing a sea of blue with these little yellow telephones? What do we gain by adding a splash of yellow to the shoulder pad? What do we gain by adding a little yellow to his thumb here? What's this? What does this add to the design here? What have we achieved with the belt perfectly blending into the rest of the costume? There are areas where Insomniac's Wolverine is undeniably stronger than this one. Definitely in terms of overall design readability. Even though they are once again squared off, at least I can see the fucking tiger stripes on Insomniac's one. That's not to say, though, that I think either of these costumes are bad by any stretch. I really don't think anything is gained with the square shape language, and MCU Wolverine definitely did the cowl better, but both of these are still immediately recognizable as Wolverine, and both of these costumes look kind of believable as something that Wolverine could wear. So what's even the problem? What's the point of talking about these things? Because feedback is useful. Sure, the suits are good now, in my opinion. Sure, these are good suits, but these could be amazing. But a separate conversation is what Wolverine was wearing for decades prior. Wolverine's yellow suit in Deadpool and Wolverine is as celebrated as it is because it was the first one. Back in 2000, before we had Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, we had yeah, that guy. We had that guy's X-Men. Why did I just mention Raimi's Spider-Man? Well, because Raimi's Spider-Man was a game changer in terms of superhero costumes in 21st century superhero adaptations, in that he actually resembled his comic book counterpart. This was not a given at the time by any stretch, though, because in 2000, we had X-Men, where the X-Men rocked up wearing black leather costumes, even making a joke about how kind of silly the yellow spandex would have been. This was undeniably a product of the time. This was a product of low confidence in this part of the IP, and what's so weird is looking back at the very first X-Men movie, it's a very comic booky movie, and it makes you wonder why they drew the line at yellow spandex. But we got Wolverine here, and he too is in the black leather. But I do want to give these things props. There are a couple of little things here and there where the black leather suits actually got it right. There are areas where these things did at least try to have some relationship with the source material. For one, these are not just black leather biker outfits like people tend to pretend they are. They had a golden yellow piping going throughout them. And we can see how they interpreted different aspects of Wolverine's design here. From the stripes that stretch over his shoulders, to the shoulder pads, which are now much more kind of like padding in the suit. And look, this costume actually does the tiger stripes better than the MCU or Insomniac versions because it doesn't feel the need to square them off. But what's funny is I did mention how MCU costumes are kind of just tactical combat armor with superhero design stuff just wrapped around them. That's really just the evolution of this. The X-Men wore homogenized black leather uniforms that were a staple of the time. However, the designers did try to add design elements of classic Wolverine to this new design. I mean, in terms of design philosophy, I wouldn't say there's any real difference between this and the Falcon's main costume in the MCU prior to becoming Captain America. The one he wore from Age of Ultron onwards. By and large, the costume has nothing in common with the comic book look, but it has little elements of it on the chest. But one of these has a reputation for comic accuracy that the other doesn't. The costumes would receive a bit of an upgrade in X-Men 2. Now with each of them having a big X going across the chest, and that includes Wolverine, and you can see how they've incorporated it with all the other design elements of Wolverine's costume. Also, the belt is mostly obscured this time, but the yellow piping is a lot more pronounced. As an evolution of the previous design, I'd say this is a successful evolution. I would say that this is a little nicer than the previous one. He wears the same again in X-Men 3, and then he doesn't really wear a Wolverine costume as such until X-Men Days of Future Past. And of the, costumes Wolverine wore, this is by far the weakest. So he wears this in kind of like the destroyed future. And what do I even really say about this? It was becoming harder to excuse not incorporating more elements of the comic design come Days of Future Past because this movie released in 2014. The MCU had firmly established itself with kind of comic book accurate aesthetics, so seeing Wolverine rocking up in just a generic combat armor, it just didn't really cut the cheese. There are yellow stripes going down the arms, and he does actually have like yellow spandex on underneath this black metal armor harness, but you can't see him because he's wearing a black metal armor harness. He really was anything but classic Wolverine, which does make me appreciate the suits that we have now. But I will say, those early 2000s black leather suits did have some elements that I think the modern Wolverine costumes could actually learn from. Mainly just retaining that triangular shape language. But like, look at the X-Men 2 Wolverine costume, for example. Just the general design blocking of this. Take this and make it not leather, and then put it in the classic colors, and then you've basically got it. Personally, I do think Wolverine's outfit should be more like a luchador kind of tank top. I really don't think Wolverine is the kind of guy to spend hours getting himself into armor before going into battle. But what do you guys think? Comment below, discuss. Do you have a favorite Wolverine suit? Do you have a least favorite Wolverine suit? Like the video if you liked it, dislike the video if you disliked it, subscribe for more like this, and hype the video to help it find its way in the algorithm. Or don't, do none of that, it's fine, it's all good, we good. And now, a special thank you shout out for the patrons in the $5 and above tier. We have Manelza, KB, Twilight, Biotin, Sirius the Skeptic, and Mr. SP. Kale Bennett, Speed, my pup kind of channelless. Thank you, Kale Bennett. Dare Danny, Sad Goku, Ghostly Phantom, Xanderwolf, Channel Pup, Lifeform Data Successfully Copied, Council of Geeks, SSSO6, Carlex, RT0, Marv Animation, Grant Allen, Josh Strider, Silver, Ben Raven, Basic Content, Gideon Wells, Press Play to Jason, Joseph Tribble, and Cho Henshin. Thank you, folks, so much for your generosity. And as for the rest of you, the buffet is still open. Get yourself another plate at the buffet. Keep yourself fed. Get your tummies full. Goodbye.